Well, thanks very much. It's certainly a real pleasure to be here and to be able to engage in a topic that I think is increasingly relevant in the education sector, but I think it's starting to have some substantial societal impact. And so the discussions over the next few days and some of the resources that Chris has already shared to lead us up to this are very beneficial, I think, in helping us to do exactly what Chris referenced, which is this destabilizing our understanding of what MOOCs are and the role that they play in society. Now for some, oh there we go, my Mac seems to have decided to freeze here. So first let's talk a little bit about a context or a bit of background around MOOCs as a whole. What is it that gives them some of the weight and the influence that they have in society currently? And there's a variety of factors. Some of this I don't think will be new to anyone in the room here. One of the biggest areas is, of course, the development of the e-learning sector or the e-learning space as a whole. Quite simply, online learning at this stage is one of the fastest growing aspects of the education sector. Whereas much of the traditional market, even though, in spite of the claims, the university is far from dead, but the growth has slowed in most parts of the world. There are certainly regions where you're still experiencing double-digit increases in the education sector, but a big area of growth is actually in the e-learning or online learning space, whether that's higher ed or whether that's in the K-12 sector. So some significant activity going on in those spaces. Also, which you've likely seen, is the development of enrollment numbers. Students who've taken an online course in a span of about 10 years have basically gone from less than 10% to now being 30+%, in some cases approaching 50% or more. So there's a lot of interest in this format or this approach to learning in this environment. Now this isn't entirely new. There are systems such as Fathom. I'm not sure how many of you recall Fathom. Okay, so there's a few. The big lesson there obviously is, being early is as expensive as being wrong. And so Fathom was a system that was intended to be a response to some of these really substantial trends of going online. But the way it was deployed, the way it was enacted, didn't quite align with the pace of change that was needed in the university sector, or put another way, university and society just wasn't quite ready for the online learning space at that stage. Normally I walk around, but for some reason my clicker's not working, so I'll be tethered to the desk here. One of the big challenges, though, around this is that educationally, in addition to the growth of online learning, some bit of being a bit gun-shy because there have been some failed online learning projects, probably the most substantial factor that is driving MOOCs, and I'll get into a little more detail in a few slides, but is really the growing diversity of student profiles. So at this point, we're looking at less than half the students in the US would now be classified as full-time students. And out of all the trends out there, this is probably the most substantial. And this was referenced by the Chancellor, which is when you go from 20% university completion rates and in terms of students entering higher education, all of a sudden you're talking 60 or 70%, you have a different profile of a student, and the system has to provide a different level of support. Now the difficulty around this, though, is that in virtually every single state, you've had enormous bloodletting since about 2008 in terms of public support for the university sector. There's really only two systems. You can't see it here very well, but Wyoming and North Dakota are the only two that have actually had a budget increase. Other than that, some systems are looking at 50+% reductions in public support. So that's one of the contexts that is putting a lot of cost pressures on the education system. Because when state funding reduces, where does the revenue come from? Obviously in the form of tuition. So that's a significant factor as well. But I'd like to make the argument, and I will pick up on this in bits and pieces, is that one of the big aspects of our educational context is that the need for individuals and their skill sets, their ability to function in a society, are connected with what is needed by the economy of a society. So advanced economies such as US, Germany, many of the European Union regions, they've seen a dramatic change where interaction and transaction jobs, which would fit, interaction jobs would be really part of the creative sector, transaction jobs would be part of the service sector, just to use slightly different language. They outpace and now significantly overshadow production jobs, which 50 years ago would have been the largest component of the economy. Emerging economies, China and India being notable reasonable, they still have close to 50% of their economy is driven by more traditional transaction-oriented jobs. So quite simply, an employee or a student that graduates from higher education, in spite of the many roles that higher education plays in society, one of those is obviously employment preparation, or the ability, as one person put it, to be privately happy and publicly useful. And so that aspect, the employability dimension of it, is significant, which means the corporate space or the work setting now requires employees with a different capacity of skills, primarily geared towards the creative side of the spectrum. Now, unfortunately, and this is in reference back to the previous slide, what we've seen is the reduction in support from state levels or government funding of education to a dramatic increase from the student perspective. And as you make your students pay more, they alter their expectations as well in terms of what they want from the system and how they expect to relate to the system. So we then end up with this formula of why is it that we have MOOCs today? And I think there's a variety of factors. I'll detail this in the next slide. But we have MOOCs for primarily a few reasons. One is we've seen an enormous diversification of knowledge needs by society. Secondly, we've seen tremendous advancement of technology and the internet, mobile, social network software, and so on. As a result of that, we have students now that are very proficient. Unlike when Fathom first initiated their platform, students today have a level of technical proficiency. Technology has achieved a level of ease of use so that anyone, for example, something as simple as the iPhones and iPads, they make easy use of technology available to the masses, something that PCs actually never did to the same level that these devices have. And so they've had an enormous impact in this regard. Now, the last part of this equation is quite critical, which is that universities have been surprisingly moot or surprisingly unprepared or perhaps completely uninterested in some of the activities going on in this space. So we have MOOCs for these reasons. So these things combined, these factors combined, put us into this stage where now there's a lot of attention and interest in MOOCs. One of the challenges, though, with MOOCs is that most MOOCs today enshrine or optimize or even instantiate the education system of the past. So MOOCs would have been a terrific model for 1980s because of the knowledge needs that were essentially required or the knowledge needs that were significant at that time. From the perspective of higher education, the perspective of learning needs, this is actually not a good thing. This is, I would say, a bad thing that MOOCs create an instantiation of an education system that I would argue is less relevant today and needs to change quite dramatically. One of the best statements that sort of captures or summarizes this is from Carl Jaspers in The Idea of the University, where he states that both students and teacher are unhappy when they're changed to curricula and syllabi for a variety of reasons, tests, standards, and so on. In this atmosphere where you essentially develop testable factual knowledge, you stifle genuine understanding in a spirit of adventure that's really required for creative or creative economy. Or put another way, any education system or an education system that fails to emulate the characteristics of information in that era is doomed to fail. You can't fight the dominant mode and structure of information. The way people engage, the way people create, the way people share, you can't expect individuals outside of the classroom to socially, collaboratively create information, to create whether it's Wikipedia or some of the drivel that occurs on Twitter or Facebook or whatever other spaces. You can't fight that dominant way of interacting with and creating information to be ignored by a university system, for example, and have that university still be successful in the long run. Because the way society interacts with information is the way business interacts with information, which is the way that the economic structure of information is being generated. So information today is a variety of factors, but there's just a few criteria: open, distributed, scalable, generative, self-organized, networked, and so on. MOOCs, the way they're being pictured today or being created today, aren't any of those things. But again, this is something that I'll pick up on a little bit later. So here's sort of the core assertion that I'm making with regard to MOOCs. What we're seeing in higher education is essentially a complexification. And this complexification means that learning needs are dramatic, ongoing, lifelong. We've heard this for a long time. We're also seeing that a simple, singular narrative isn't going to suffice going forward. That this notion of, oh, we should go to university so that we get a job and live the American dream, or have whatever vision you have of what higher education does for you. That simple narrative of higher education simply doesn't exist anymore. So the idea of the university is expanding, and it's diversifying, and as a consequence, what we're seeing happening with MOOCs right now is essentially the creation, or is the MOOCs addressing the shadow education system that has already been in play, partly due to the challenges economically that society has, partly due to the fact that we're constantly learning on a constant basis. So I don't think MOOCs are competition with the existing university system. If anything, I would like to know this motion, and consider this in whatever spiritual terms you want, but it's essentially, you know, the university among us. It's this notion of the higher education system as being more tightly integrated and more central to all domains of society, rather than an isolated standalone place that you go to for 4 years and have fond memories of as you age and periodically write checks to. It's essentially university becoming much like the language and the discourse of higher education. I've never seen a period where higher education is more prominent in, you know, PBS, ABC, New York Times, the Times Magazine. The quality or the interest in the higher education system in public spaces is absolutely unprecedented, from my experience at least. And so there really is this sense that a lot of people are starting to care about the university. It was interesting hearing the minister's background with IMF. I just saw this morning on BBC, where they announced that IMF is actually going to use edX's open platform now to run a series of MOOCs. Why? Because they want to increase the financial literacy or the monetary awareness of people around the world, so that they're more familiar with the work of IMF. So again, this is just a simple example of the diversification of knowledge needs of a society, and the way in which university or MOOCs are beginning to serve sort of that shadow economy. And systems like the recent initiative by Georgia Tech with AT&T and Udacity, the development of the $6,000 Masters in Computer Science, is just one example where you're seeing companies, corporations saying, okay, we need people with comp sci degrees. We're not getting them produced, so if you call it that, by the university system. We have to become more proactive, and the expectation here is in a short period of time you'll have thousands, tens of thousands of comp sci students that aren't in place right now. Quick example of this, I mean, I know MOOCs are quite often critiqued for their poor completion rates, but one of the first MOOCs that was run by edX, or at that point it was MITx, was a MOOC on circuits. And the prof that ran this particular MOOC ended up with, as with any MOOC, a low completion rate in this 5-6% level, I believe. But that 5 to 6%, based on scale, he graduated more students out of that course than he had over a 40-year career of teaching that particular course. So you can critique the completion rates all you want, but the scale is so large that the real question is not what's the completion rate, but it's how many people are graduating or completing this course, in contrast to who had done in the past. And coincidentally, I think it was a 16-year-old girl from India that was one of the top performers in that course. So these are the kinds of things that, when I talk about the diversification and the complexification of the education sector, it's really in response to some of those challenges, that perpetual, continual, lifelong learning. And just to sort of hit home the fact that these are not your traditional students. This is from an Edinburgh report. University of Edinburgh ran some analysis of what they found with their students, and only 21% of the students that took this particular MOOC were what I would look at as competition with the traditional bachelor's degree program in most universities. The vast majority of students that participated were in the 25 to 64 year age group. So these aren't individuals who are necessarily learning to get a degree. These are individuals who are more involved in professional learning or personal advancement. And that's again supported by this particular assessment of what level of education. Over 70% of students that took this particular MOOC had a bachelor's or a master's degree. So the level of education of students taking this, these aren't your, I just graduated from high school, now I really want to learn about some complex subject students. So from the current standpoint then, MOOCs are sort of seen as being the hub of change. They're driving this change, they're getting the attention, the recognition, they're sucking all the oxygen out of the education discussion. But essentially MOOCs are more accurately seen, I think, as a node that is part of an expanding ecosystem that focuses on ed tech innovation, emerging pedagogy, and some of those challenges that are very quickly taking hold within society. And that's reflected as well with this enormous explosion of ed tech startups, where the ed tech ecosystem is now really the gold rush of the startup space. So Silicon Valleyism is happening to the ed tech space. And the Silicon Valley philosophy is very simple. Everything is broken, we'll build it from ground up, but charge you for it, but we'll make it look like it's free. And so that's what's happening in the education sector right now. So I was very heartened this morning, actually, to see a report by the Committee on Institutional Cooperation that said, you know what? While we recognize that for-profit participation in the education sector is relevant and important, we don't want to outsource core competencies to a for-profit or a private company. And a core competency obviously is MOOCs and delivery of those kinds of platform, or that type of instruction. And in all fairness, it's the university's fault. So I'm not trying to gloss that over. The MOOCs exist because universities did nothing while the internet continued to grow and develop, and so the ossification of higher education became a challenge, and it took somebody from the outside to run a series of these open courses to really draw some attention and change the conversation. But fortunately, systems are now saying, wait a second, higher education is a societal good. It is not strictly an economic transaction. We as a university system, as a publicly funded system, even though publicly funded these days means, you might get a few percentage points of your funding from the public. It's not what it meant in the past. But nonetheless, publicly funded systems see a mandate that goes beyond simply preparing students for employment. It's about generating an equitable society and preserving a democratic model of governance. So that, I think, was a consequential paper, and I hope to see more universities think along those lines, that question, do we really want to outsource our core competencies? Now, one of the things that's been substantial, though, is that 2012 New York Times declared it the year of the MOOC, and fortunately humanity is a bit like a pendulum. Actually, there was one author I read years ago, C.S. Lewis, actually said humanity is like a drunkard that gets on a horse, falls off one side, gets back on, and then falls off the other side. And so 2012 was the year of the MOOC. Well, now we're the year of the anti-MOOC, and so we see a lot of criticisms around MOOCs, and I do agree, this notion of the politician's syllogism is quite accurate. We must do something, this is something, therefore we must do this. And for a lot of states and even some university presidents, MOOCs are this is something that we must do. But the conversation is becoming more nuanced. At one point it was just MOOCs are wonderful, and now we're starting to get down to the details and understanding what is it that MOOCs actually are and what is it they actually represent. So there's concern about MOOCs as threatening profs' intellectual property, because what happens with a MOOC, if it's in Coursera, a university can offer it or perhaps repurpose it depending on the licensing scheme, so you may well have given away some of your resources in the process. Or the outsourcing of public higher education has been an argument that's increasingly gaining traction as well, that as a result of the for-profit presence, there's a few, Coursera still has all the ideals of a higher education system. And I think that's because the leaders of Coursera I genuinely feel they're passionate about education and increasing access to education. Udacity is more profit-driven, and you can see with some of the contracts that they're signing with San Jose State and other systems where they really do want a piece of the pie. I think Coursera and certainly edX still have the ideals of higher education prevalent in the approach that they have to their partnerships and the groups that they want to work with. But faculty are starting to say, wait a second, maybe this whole MOOC thing, and it's worth noting that MOOCs, every MOOC that I'm aware of at least, has come from either the IT side of the house or the administrative side of the house. And personally, I blame no one but faculty, but I'll get onto that in a little bit. But Duke faculty and a few other systems are starting to say, wait a second, I don't like how we're moving. There's too many outstanding questions. There's too much at risk here, and we're not convinced that this is going to be a quality degree or a quality learning experience. Similarly, Harvard profs, they're starting to say, we want greater oversight of these MOOCs or these systems these courses that edX is offering. You can't build a parallel education system to what we have right now, use the profs that are funded in this education system to undermine that education system as well. So for about a year and a half of being surprisingly quiet and pretending that MOOCs will go away, faculty are sort of at a point now where they're saying, wait a second, I'm not comfortable with this. And in all fairness, I'd like to emphasize that I really don't blame anyone except faculty, because it's faculty that have largely lost the narrative on MOOCs and that have lost the narrative on innovation. And what's happening now is faculty are starting to push back a little bit. When someone else has framed the discussion for you, you will always lose on logic, because anything you say eventually is going to be compared to the framework of the discussion that's been created. So the education system, the way we understand it today, is really about employment, which isn't 100% accurate. Basic research in many systems is being devalued as it's being emphasized for greater commercialization activity, and market forces and competition drive education's future. So in many ways, now, this is cynical, but it's not entirely inaccurate, that the reason we have a crisis in education is because we've defunded education. And as a result of defunding education, yes, now we need to start looking at other models and other approaches to deal with education. So it's cynical, but I also think it's accurate. So that's the challenge from a faculty perspective, is that the conversation around MOOCs is one that really we should have owned and we should have driven, but we didn't. And as a consequence, outsiders came along and sort of took over the conversation. Now faculty are starting to say, we'd like to actually play in this space after all. And sort of finally, sort of wrap up the details here, the MOOC conversation has really gone in some interesting spaces, hyped to death, like no other concept ever has been. But now we're starting to see some greater clarification of what are MOOCs actually, and we're starting to realize that, that beautiful partner that we saw after we had those 12 tequila shots last night, and you wake up in the morning and you find, oh, maybe they're not perfect after all. And so you're seeing a few examples now where MOOCs are becoming mortal, and suddenly they're not this do everything and change everything. And so Coursera, for example, which I was very surprised at this transaction, because up until that point, Coursera was the flag bearer for change and innovation, and all of a sudden, in one fell swoop, they became a content provider to the education system. So maybe that's what they always saw themselves as being, and maybe the problem was with my image of what they were. But Coursera and other systems, Udacity, initially they were going to be a brilliant MOOC, change the education system. Now they're basically providing remedial education support. They have reduced themselves to a node within the education system rather than an entire model that changes the education system. So it's been interesting how quickly, like every morning you wake up and something new happened in MOOCs last night, and that changed the landscape. So we'll see what it is tomorrow morning. But let's just step back a little bit and talk about what MOOCs are from a perspective of the different ways of considering change and change models. So with some of the perhaps slightly snarky comments I've had about MOOCs, I do want to emphasize two things. One, I do not think that the education system is broken, right? That narrative is such a mind-numbingly silly narrative that, but it's gained traction, and so everybody will stand up. I was at South by Southwest EDU, and I was walking down the hallway in a group of 20, I think there's 3 21-year-old guys walking in front of me, and they're ranting about how we can transform education system. The education system is broken, and suddenly you start to feel like you're old and cantankerous, right? When you're saying like, come on, what do you know about the education system beyond bars and beers? But so it's not that, so the sense that there are people who are recipients of the education system are the transformers of the education system. It's really the sense that we are changing for the sake of change rather than a vision of something new and different. Years ago, I was a Catholic priest. I did this silent retreat. I'm not Catholic, but so I did this silent retreat where I had to spend time not talking, which, as you could imagine, may be a challenge. And each day for 1 hour, the priest would come in and he'd light a bunch of candles, and I'd have to patiently wait, and then he would ask a series of questions that I would respond to. And that was all the talking I could do that day. And he made a brilliant point that's really guided my thinking in many areas of life in one of these sessions, where he said, never move away from something. Because if you move away from something, you never know where you're going to end up. Always move towards something. So never leave, never break the university system. Always create a vision for something better. Don't fight the system, move toward a vision of something more positive. And so that's still very much been sort of my thinking on the university sector as well. So that's, I think, the challenge that a lot of the rhetoric and the dialogue that we hear about the education sector and the need for transformation and education is broken, my first point is, no, it's not. The education system is doing exactly what it was made to do. What's happened isn't that the education system is broken, it's that the learning needs of society has advanced. And so now it's not, the system is working great, but it's just not aligned with the knowledge needs of society anymore. So that's point one. Secondly, I do believe we need dramatic structural changes to higher education. I would personally be quite pleased if the faculty and the academy would be the ones driving that rather than externals, but we'll see how that unfolds going forward. So we're going to talk about two particular change models. This one is a bit of a tortured comparison, but I'm going to make it anyway until someone stands up and says, no, you can't compare scientific revolution with the change university because it's completely different. But until we do that, I'll say Kuhn emphasized this accumulation of anomalies. And so when you have a series of anomalies that build up, they don't function within normal science. Normal science will discard those anomalies over a period of time. What happens at a certain stage, though, is the anomalies build up to such a level where we can't discount them with our existing research. And so we then have something along the lines of phase changes. I don't like that other P word, so I'm going to ignore that. And what ends up then is we end up with dramatic change. We have an alteration of some of the core premises that we used to use to look at the world. We have a development of a new framework that accounts for those sub-changes or anomalies that we used to ignore. And I would argue, again, I know it's a little tortured, but I would argue that that's exactly where we are with higher education. We've tried to make the university bend and twist and contort to respond to all of these enormous knowledge needs in society. And we've tried to do that with a course model. And we've tried to do that with the research model that we have. And all of a sudden now, I think we've seen enough anomalies accumulate that it's time to start thinking, okay, stop. Why is this system not working the way we think it should? What do we have to do? What do we have to rethink? And there's a variety of, I'm not going to go into all of them, but there's a variety of factors, whether it is the granularization of learning, namely we are no longer course-based learning needs in society, whether it is the move towards competency models of education, the use of learning analytics, the use of social participatory pedagogies, the list goes on. But at a certain stage, you can't tweak a system enough to make it still function for the needs of a particular context. Sometimes you just have to rethink the whole thing. And this is what someone like Carlotta Perez, who is probably one of my favorite, even though she wouldn't call herself a change theorist, but she's written extensively on when do you have enormous shifts. So the Kuhnian paradigm shifts are actually, they don't occur as often. I mean, if you go to conferences, we have a paradigm shift roughly every week, as often as we change our socks and underwear. But if you look at historically, they don't happen very often. These are things that happen every century or two. And so that's one change model where it doesn't happen as frequently as we expect it would. But a second change model that I think is very accurate is the work of Carlotta Perez. And it's really a techno-socioeconomic model, but I'm just looking at two dimensions, namely the technological dimension. And that's that there's an installation period where you have rapid technological growth, infrastructure is being brought into place, and then you have some type of a turning point or a crisis, and this is where you begin to have the new system align with the new technology. I'll bring a second perspective to hopefully clarify, because that was a little vague. In the 80s, there was some discussion within economics about the statement that we have computers everywhere except in the productivity stats. And namely the emphasis being, great, now we've got all these computers, but what are we doing better or different, or what have we gained as a consequence? And so an individual, Paul A. David, decided to look at when have we had broad-scale technological changes and how did they produce some kind of an outcome. So he actually looked at the electrification of America. So he went back and he looked at when the dynamo, the electrical engine, was brought in, what happened to the physical spaces of the manufacturing sector. So historically, factory, multi-story building, central shaft, powered by an engine in the basement, belts coming off the shaft on each floor. If a belt went down, the whole floor went down. If the engine in the basement went down, the whole factory went down. So that was the model. All of a sudden, people got, the electric engine was developed and electricity was slowly being brought across America. So what did these manufacturing plants do? They would take out the other engine and put in the dynamo, the electrical engine. And nothing changed, right? So you had this sense that it was the installation phase, to use Perez's language. But over a period of time, and David discovered that it was a segment of about 40 years where you had these engines being brought in, and slowly people realized, oh, this is something different, or if you're familiar with Gibson's notion of affordances, namely the action potential of a particular tool. If you look at the affordances of it, it's different. So we don't need to have a central shaft anymore because we can actually run outlets and people plug in locally and the engines. So if one floor, one item goes down, it doesn't kill the whole floor. The thing still stays functional and operational. And so that's essentially what we found is once the installation period is, there's a period where you need structural change to fully take advantage of the new innovation. So a quick example then, together with Stephen Downs and some work with Dave Cormier, we've run a series of open online courses, and I just briefly want to talk about what those courses were like and what our mindset was behind those open courses. And the perspective of DS 106, which is another course that's been run as well. I haven't been involved in it, but a group of colleagues and friends have run this iteration. And to borrow someone else's language, namely the one I had earlier with Jasper's, is the goal here is to unchain students, not just students, but faculty from curriculum and syllabi, and to really start focusing on creativity. How can we make the university, as an idea, as an instantiation, align with the knowledge needs that will allow people in society to solve complex knowledge problems? For example, SARS in 2003 is one of those examples of a complex knowledge challenge that wasn't solved by what I would call duplication knowledge, right? Where we take what somebody knew and apply it to something new. It's what I look at as being generative knowledge, where new things are created, new ideas are developed. And so I hope I'm not being too unfair to Coursera and edX. I think they're outstanding platforms, and I absolutely applaud the work that's being done there. But if you have the mic, then you can bring in your own bias. So what we did with our system, so I would say Coursera and edX have a perspective of knowledge as duplication oriented. A successful course is one where your student comes to understand what you understand. And that's why you have heavy testing, heavy quizzing, heavy assessment, because what you're really trying to do is, does your student have the knowledge profile that you yourself have? And some of the open courses, there have been a variety. Kurt Bonk's here as well. He's done this with Blackboard. Ray Schroeder has done this with EduMOOC. We've done it with courses that we've offered. So there's a variety of individuals in the academic space that have said, we don't quite want to duplicate knowledge. We do want people to get out there and create stuff, generate things, create artifacts of understanding, share it with others, and have that become a node in their creation of new ideas themselves. So this is just a very quick example of the software architecture that we used. So each week would start off with either a short intro video or a few readings, those kinds of things, just to get the conversation started. But we didn't do assessment in the traditional sense where it was, do this quiz and we'll grade you. What we tried to emphasize instead is we had expectations of students to be able to create artifacts that reflect their understanding. These artifacts then, and so my mindset is, if you learn transparently, you become a teacher. And so as a student interacted with a particular idea or concept, they would create a mind map or a concept map or an image or a podcast or a video or whatever else, and that in turn would serve as a sense-making element for another student. So that's how it started off, but instead of wanting everything to happen in one set space, we really said, look, you learn wherever you feel like learning. We really don't care where. Hopefully you'll have an RSS output in whatever space you learn. So whether you learn with blogs or a learning management system, whether you use social media, social bookmarking tools like Digo or Delicious, or whether you use Twitter or nowadays I guess it would be Vine or Facebook or other tools, it really doesn't matter what you use. The important thing is you own your spaces of interaction because that's your identity. You own the space where you create your content and share your images. We don't want to ever have the ability to shut down your access or to delete the artifacts that you've created. It's this notion of a domain of one's own. And so what we did is students, when they take a course with the software that Stephen Downs has developed and that we've improved over subsequent iterations, as you share your blog or your space wherever you are as a person. And it's Grasshopper is the software, and so it basically harvests the activity in all those spaces. simple language query against what's there. So it'll pull in the Twitter tag for the course, it'll pull in blog articles for the course, Digo bookmarks, and so on. Run the simple filter against that, and then we generate the daily, which is a daily email that includes everything that learners have produced in the course. So a large part of our mindset, and it does make some faculty quite uncomfortable, but a large part of our mindset is this. In the past, the education model has been one where the faculty member is the center of the experience, the spoke kind of model of the faculty member. We've really tried to emphasize the faculty member as a node in an overall network. And that node and again, this reflects the diversification of knowledge in society. It doesn't mean that faculty member is no less consequential, but it just means that students are bringing in resources from wherever. They're sharing TED Talk links. Now they're going to take different MOOCs or content from other spaces. They're using MIT's OpenCourseWare, or whatever university's OpenCourseWare initiative. So the faculty member is no longer the sole provider of information. Instead, they are a critical central node still, but certainly not the exclusive node or the dominant node in the sense that they've been in the past. Instead, you get something that looks more like a distributed network with many participants as learners and teachers and many information sources. And that relates, I think, to our view, and I am heavily influenced by Marlene Scardmalia and Carl Breider's emphasis on knowledge building and knowledge generation at all sectors of the education economy, if you will. Which means whether a student is a K-12 student or whether they're in higher education, this notion that you have to be a master's student or beyond before you think like a researcher isn't accurate. The sense that anyone at any level can generate stuff. They can run experiments, they can develop hypotheses, they can test them. Nowadays with a mess of data, they can develop algorithms, they can use analytics tools. So anyone, regardless of knowledge level or even expertise in a subject area, is a potential generator of new knowledge. And again, there's issues with some of these systems. You do need control points. There's issues with social produced systems like Wikipedia, but there's also ways in which the formal expert system of knowledge generation can work well with the amateur system. Amateur astronomy is probably one of the best examples of this kind of system. But so essentially what I'm trying to emphasize is that if we want higher education to become this integrated structure that touches all aspects, the university among us kind of model. If that's what we want, then we have to stop thinking of the university as a space where we want students to duplicate what we already know. Instead, it needs to become a space where students become creative people and generators of new information. Again, if you go back to the chart I had earlier about the percentage of the economy now that is production oriented, that needs people who can duplicate stuff, now sits at under 15%. The vast majority of the economy now is about people who can create things and do new things. And so what ends up happening is, from the university perspective, and I'm sort of winding down with a few quick slides here, when systems are distributed the way that our information system is in higher education, we need alternative modes and means of integration, because the key challenge from a student perspective is, yes, you can learn everything that you need to essentially be knowledgeable at a master's and a PhD level. You can learn all of that on the web. The problem is, it's a bloody mess, right? How do you know what's important when you start? How do you know what's consequential? So the value of a faculty member as a guide, working with learning designers to create an effective pathway through what is noise, what is consequential, is critical. So what we need then is a new way to think about a large part of the education system and the role of faculty in relation to learners. So it's part of the challenge is to create something that is a new integrated whole, and an integrated whole that goes beyond the university as an integrator of information to one that moves to the university as a network that is laid on top of all dimensions of society. And so just a very quick illustration of what that potentially could look like, and I won't go into great detail with this slide here, but it's just that for education system, integration is a key value point. Even though we learn in a variety of distributed ways, in order for us to become knowledgeable, we have to form coherent connections between those distributed points of information. If we don't form connections between those distributed points of information, we essentially have isolated knowledge that in some cases is in conflict with each other. So from an education perspective, it's really about recognizing some of the key roles, whether it's administration, research, teaching, learning, curriculum, assessment, accreditation. We're now seeing, for a variety of reasons, all of these are being driven by commercial interests. And so for university leaders, the question becomes, what do we need to own and what can we afford to outsource? What is critical that we continue to generate and create ourselves, and what can we begin to partner with the private sector? Because you have to start thinking that way. Again, the university is no longer a singular entity that serves a singular narrative in society. The university is becoming this very diverse, very broad, multifaceted, multi-need serving system, and that requires that we begin to think strategically about who do we work with and who do we partner with. Do we work with Ambanet or Pearson in terms of curriculum development? Do we work with or do we utilize open courseware products such as MIT, OCW, and others instead? What about assessment and accreditation? University or the Wisconsin, for example, with their competency-based degree, which has received a lot of recognition or attention in higher education circles, is just one example of a potentially innovative approach to what might assessment and accreditation look like. We can't expect in a multifaceted, multidimensional world that people will still want to take courses and only get a degree. There needs to be a way to account for lifelong, life-wide learning as well. And so finally, we end up at this stage then where it's important to think about what is the university as a member of society. What role is it that universities are supposed to do for us? And what is it that MOOCs are able to do to help advance that mission rather than replace the university mission? And I think in many ways, one of the biggest roles of higher education, and I should mention, I'm with Athabasca University now. We're a 100% online system. We're a publicly funded research system, so that means that we don't have a for-profit mandate, but we do everything from bachelor's to master's through to doctoral programs. And one of the things, whenever I'm at a campus like this, and now admittedly you have a nice lake, so that you get extra points just for that. But whenever I'm at a campus like this, there's that real vibe of social connectivity. There's that sense of community, that sense of energy that only comes from physical space, that only comes from people connecting and bumping into each other. So there's this sense of social and academic connection to the university, social and academic, or just social connection more broadly to society, the university as an integrated structure in society as a whole. But also a key part of what universities do is they help to develop this acknowledged interdependence, where what we are is part of a society and part of a system, and we ourselves aren't knowledgeable as an individual entity, but instead it's that knowledgeability through connectedness that becomes key, or to integrate the university more deeply with the knowledge needs of society. And so I guess where we end up then is this question of disruptor, savior, or distractor, and I think it's exactly what the Chancellor stated earlier, is that it is all of those on different levels and for different individuals. So for some faculty members, definitely it is a disruptor, because I have no doubt that certain college schools and systems will have a reduction of academic positions due to the development of online learning and MOOCs. So there's a disruptor. I also think that there is an unfortunate cost focus. Online learning done well rarely reduces costs, but nonetheless, some people still think it does. We've found at Athabasca University and any other online system that you've probably interacted with, you find that in many ways it's as expensive or more expensive than other, especially if you're going to give a quality online experience. For someone though who is in India, I met with a group of students in New Delhi last year, and for them to be able to access courses through Coursera and through edX, absolutely a savior. The quality of instruction that they received there, being able to hear directly from the person that literally wrote the textbook in their field, was tremendous for them, and it was a savior type of concept. To be able to access that quality of learning is tremendous. A distractor, I think at some levels, this is the least relevant aspect of this triad of questions. Is I don't believe MOOCs are a distractor. I believe, if anything, MOOCs help to sharpen the educational awareness and raise the discussion of what do universities need to do in society, and what kinds of a knowledge institution are we going to need to help us address the very complex knowledge challenge that our society faces. Everything from poverty to economic crises to changing weather patterns, to the list goes on. And I would argue that what you really need is a distributed network university structure, not an isolated sit in a physical space system. So on that note, I think we're going to pause and engage in questions for the next 15 or so minutes. And if there are no questions, we will look at each other.